Few events in modern history have reshaped international politics as profoundly as the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. For some, it fulfilled an ancient hope of national return and self-determination. For others, it marked the beginning of displacement, loss, and a conflict that endures. Today, I'm going to lay out step by step how Israel was created, what led up to it, what happened in 1947 and 1948, and what followed in the immediate aftermath. This video uses commonly accepted historical terms you may hear in different contexts. Zionism refers to the modern movement for Jewish national self-determination in the land historically associated with the Jewish people. The Mandate refers to British administration over Palestine after World War I. The 1948 conflict is called different names: Israel's War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba, meaning catastrophe. Throughout, I'll try to explain what happened and how people at the time understood it. Let's start with the long background, the connection between people and place. In ancient times, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah existed in the land that later became known as Palestine, under the Romans. A series of conquests, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, reshaped the region over centuries. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, after revolts against Rome, many Jews were dispersed across the Mediterranean and beyond in what we call the Jewish diaspora. Even so, Jewish communities continued to live in the land in varying numbers alongside others, including Samaritans, Christians, and later, Muslims and Arabic-speaking peoples. Across the diaspora, a religious and cultural memory of the land endured. For many centuries, that memory was expressed in prayer, ritual, and pilgrimage, rather than in organized political efforts to re-establish a state. That changed in the 19th century. National movements were rising across Europe. Empire and industry were transforming societies, and anti-Semitism, both traditional and modern, provoked crises for Jewish communities. In Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, pogroms, violent attacks on Jewish communities, pushed new waves of migration. At the same time, secular political ideas spread among Jews and non-Jews alike. Out of this world emerged modern Zionism, a political project arguing that Jews were a nation entitled to self-determination in their ancestral land. One of the best-known early advocates was Theodor Herzl, who, in the 1890s, organized Zionist congresses to pursue diplomatic support for a national home. Alongside diplomacy, a practical movement took shape. Small agricultural communities were found, Hebrew was revived as a modern spoken language, and waves of Jewish migrants, called aliyot, or ascents, arrived in Ottoman-ruled Palestine. Now, we enter the era that truly sets the stage: World War I and the end of an empire. Before World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. During the war, Britain and its allies fought the Ottomans in the Middle East. Out of that conflict came promises and plans that later collided. In 1917, the British government issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, on the understanding that the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities would be protected. This declaration existed alongside other wartime communications and agreements involving Arab leaders and European powers, each with different implications for sovereignty and borders. After the war, the League of Nations assigned Britain a mandate over Palestine. This mandate incorporated the language of the Balfour Declaration and charged Britain with facilitating a Jewish national home while safeguarding the rights of all inhabitants. As the 1920s and 30s unfolded, Jewish immigration increased, Jewish institutions developed, and the distinct Arab-Palestinian national movement grew in response. Tensions rose over land purchases, political representation, and fears about future sovereignty. There were outbreaks of violence in the 1920s and again in the 1930s. The most sustained was the Arab Revolt of 1936-39, which targeted British rule and Jewish communities and was met with harsh British repression. Inquiry commissions proposed different constitutional arrangements and partition ideas. Britain issued white papers to limit immigration and adjust policy, trying to contain the unrest. But events in Europe soon overwhelmed all of this. The Second World War and the Holocaust were a decisive turning point. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered around 6 million Jews. The scale and horror of the Holocaust transformed the urgency of the Jewish refugee question, and for many, solidified support for a sovereign refuge. At the same time, Arab Palestinians were deeply concerned that large-scale Jewish immigration would permanently alter the country and deprive them of self-government. During and after the war, Britain restricted Jewish immigration to the Mandate, trying to balance competing demands and maintain stability. This led to clandestine immigration efforts by Jewish organizations, what became known as Aliyah Bet, and a growing insurgency by underground Jewish groups against British rule. The British, exhausted after World War II and facing mounting violence, ultimately referred the entire question of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN created a special committee to investigate and recommend a solution. After hearings and research, the committee proposed partition, creating two states, one Jewish and one Arab, joined by economic union, with Jerusalem placed under international administration because of its religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on this plan, often referred to as Resolution 181. Jewish leaders accepted partition as a basis for statehood, though they worried about the proposed borders and the fate of Jerusalem. Arab leaders and the Arab Higher Committee rejected it, arguing that it violated the rights of the Arab majority in the country and that the land allocation was unfair. With the vote, the situation on the ground rapidly deteriorated. A civil war phase began inside the Mandate. Jewish and Arab communities fought, supply routes were contested, and cities and villages saw violence and reprisals. As Britain prepared to end its mandate and withdraw, each side positioned itself for what would come next. May 14, 1948. The mandate ends, and the State of Israel is declared. On that day in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion read out the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration drew on historical connection, the catastrophe of the Holocaust, international support expressed in the UN vote, and the promise of equal social and political rights to all inhabitants regardless of religion, race, or sex. The United States recognized the new state that same day. The Soviet Union did as well soon after. Within hours, neighboring Arab states' armies, principally from Egypt, Transjordan, later Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, moved in. The Civil War phase became a regional war, commonly called the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The war unfolded in several phases. At first, fighting centered on control of key roads, mixed cities, and strategic positions. The new Israeli forces, drawing from pre-state militias that had merged into the Israel Defense Forces, secured critical routes and pushed back assaults in some sectors. As the war expanded, both sides mobilized more men and material. There were UN-brokered truces, failed negotiations, and renewed rounds of combat. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled more territory than the UN partition map had originally assigned. The armistice lines, often called the Green Line, left the West Bank and East Jerusalem under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian control. Jerusalem, envisioned as internationalized, was divided. Western neighborhoods under Israeli control, the Old City and Eastern neighborhoods under Jordanian control. The human impact of the 1948 war was immense. During the fighting, large numbers of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes in areas that became Israel. The number most often cited is around 700,000. Palestinians refer to this displacement as the Nakba, the catastrophe, and it remains a defining element of Palestinian identity and politics. Refugees moved to the West Bank and Gaza, as well as to Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, where many of their descendants still lived. At the same time, life changed dramatically for Jewish communities across the broader Middle East and North Africa. In the years following Israel's creation and the wider Arab-Israeli conflict, many Jews left or were expelled from countries such as Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, and Morocco, with a large portion resettling in Israel. These overlapping displacements, Palestinian and Jewish, shaped the demographics and politics of the region in lasting ways. Inside Israel, state building began immediately. The new government faced enormous tasks, organizing a national army, integrating diverse immigrant communities from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, establishing democratic institutions, reviving and standardizing Hebrew as a common language, and building an economy under the pressure of war and international uncertainty. Israel adopted a parliamentary system, held elections, and passed foundational laws, including the Law of Return in 1950, which granted Jews worldwide the right to immigrate and gain citizenship. In the early years, the state prioritized housing, basic services, and employment for hundreds of thousands of new arrivals. Cultural and political life was dynamic and sometimes contentious, as different communities, religious and secular, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, left and right, debated the direction of the country. Meanwhile, the conflict with neighboring states and with Palestinians did not end. it entered new phases. So, how did this all happen? Distilled to its core. First, there was a long historical and religious connection that endured through diaspora and memory, which modern nationalism transformed into a political project. Second, there was a collapse of empires and the redrawing of borders after World War I, which placed Palestine under British rule and introduced conflicting commitments. Third, demographic change, institution building, intercommunal violence, and the British policies during the Mandate period brought the question of sovereignty to a breaking point. Fourth, the Holocaust and the refugee crisis created unprecedented urgency for a Jewish homeland. Fifth, the United Nations proposed partition. One side accepted, the other rejected, and the war followed. Finally, out of that war emerged the State of Israel, armistice lines, a massive refugee problem, and a conflict that reshaped the Middle East. There are also the narratives people tell about these events. From a Zionist or mainstream Israeli perspective, 1948 is the story of national revival, after centuries of exile and persecution, culminating in independence against overwhelming odds. The emphasis is on self-determination, survival, and the legitimacy of international recognition through the UN process. From a Palestinian perspective, 1948 is the Nakba, the catastrophe, in which an indigenous population lost homes and lands amid war and expulsions, with their right to self-determination denied. The emphasis is on displacement, the status of refugees and their descendants, and unresolved claims to statehood and rights. Both perspectives refer to real experiences and real losses, and they remain central to how people understand the same historical movement. Grasping how Israel was created therefore involves not only the sequence of events, but also how those events live in memory, law, and politics today. Let's briefly trace the immediate aftermath, because it helps explain why the story doesn't end in 1949. In the 1950s and 60s, regional tensions persisted. Israel fought for security and recognition. Neighboring states and Palestinian groups opposed what they viewed as illegitimate dispossession. Borders were tense. There were cross-border raids, retaliations, and international crises. Later turning points, like the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, transformed the map and the conflict yet again. But all of that is for another video. Our focus in this video is to show how the state came into being, and that story truly centers on the period from the late 19th century to the armistice agreements of 1949. To close, I want to return to the human perspective. States are created through ideas, movements, diplomacy, and war, but they are experienced by people. The creation of Israel involved extraordinary hope and extraordinary trauma, sometimes within the same families, often within the same neighborhoods that changed hands or emptied overnight. It produced new citizens and new refugees, new institutions and unresolved claims that continue to shape the lives of Israelis and Palestinians and the diplomacy of countries far beyond the region. When we ask, how was Israel created? The answer is a sequence. A modern national movement, global upheavals, a mandate system that failed to produce a shared political framework, an international plan to partition the land, a declaration of statehood, and a war whose consequences still reach into the present. Understanding that sequence doesn't settle today's arguments, but it does give us a clearer map on how we arrived here. And the clearer our map of the past, the more honest and informed our conversations about the future can be. Thanks for watching this episode of Every Country. If you found it helpful, consider subscribing for more carefully researched histories and country stories. I really do hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the creation of Israel, and hope you're excited for the next video.